So the title of this talk is Clever versus Savvy. I was sitting down with Colin, and he asked me, so what do you mean by clever and savvy? Are they like software tools that you download and use? No, no, I mean the actual words. And he was like, well, clever and savvy feel like pretty similar to me. It was like, no, they should not feel similar, or at least that's not my intention. So then I Googled up their definitions, and let's try to get into the root of these two words. So cleverness, it means quick to understand. That's actually not exactly what I'm trying to get at. I think this is really what I'm getting at. Clever, what I mean by clever in this talk is showing intelligence or skill, ingenious. Like you're sort of showing off the ability of your mind. You're doing something super difficult. It's sort of like the equivalent of lifting a lot of weight at the gym to show off your physical prowess. It could be used to mean like you're showing off your mental prowess, perhaps. Whereas savvy, I'm using savvy to mean that shrewdness and practical. The keyword being practical, and common sense. Because I'm actually, to be more specific, I'm actually going to use savvy to mean knowledge about the business domain, right? Business knowledge. And I'm actually using these adjectives for code artifacts, for code that we write. If we were to generalize it beyond the domain of software, it could just be applied to written artifacts, articles, or descriptions. If we're talking about UX, it could be the description and the diagrams that you're making for the purpose of UX, communicating UX ideas. So if a piece of code is savvy, what I mean is that piece of code has a lot of business knowledge embedded in the code. And a good way to tell that is you are reading the code, and the vocabulary of the code consists of a lot of terms from the business domain. So if we're talking about a project management system, then you see words like project, teams, schedules, deadline, status, words like that, which are all vocabularies of the business domain. The opposite of savvy, so if this were a scale, this to the left is the most savvy, to the right would be the most ignorant. A piece of code that is ignorant would be code whose vocabulary is devoid of any business knowledge, devoid of any terms that's related to any business-related idea. It'll still have vocabulary, but usually the vocabulary is very generic, such as just very generic sounding variable names like X, or I don't know, num for number, or string, booleans, objects. It's all like coder speak. All the vocabularies have to do with the domain of code. And yeah, coders can talk in that language, but not the business domain people. And business domain people could care less about reading code that's ignorant because they can't relate to it. So that would be ignorant code versus savvy code. Savvy code, very business oriented, a lot of business knowledge. Ignorant code, very little or none in terms of business knowledge. Clever, what do you mean by clever? Clever code is very intricate. There's a lot of like if you were to it had a piece of code, I don't know, that's perhaps very nested, like it's very dense in terms of content, and if you drew a diagram, it's so complex, first of all, then you need to draw a diagram in order to hope to understand what's going on, and if you did draw a diagram, that diagram might be very complex, and that's what I mean by clever. So a clever piece of code is kind of complex, and it'll take someone a lot of mental power just to understand what's happening in that piece of code. And the opposite of clever, and thus, which is why I talked about like the cleverness, the ingenious. Like it seems like someone has to be a nuclear physicist to understand this piece of code. Like the person who invented the World Wide Web, for example, was a nuclear physicist of some sort, worked at CERN. That's what I heard. I hope that might be true about web programming today, unfortunately. Like you need a very smart person to understand it. But hopefully we can do better than that, and not everything needs to be super complicated. But the opposite of clever would, I'm gonna call that dumb. Dumb code is code that's very straightforward. So dumb code looks like, I don't know. It's just like one after another, and then as you are reading, you can sort of, it's like a novel that you can sort of go from the beginning to the end in one seating, and you felt like, yeah, okay, yeah, I got it. It's not anything that requires mental reflection, like days. Like you read some books and it requires days of mental reflection afterwards. That's a very dense book. Dumb is not that. Okay, so that's what I mean by clever versus savvy. And with any piece of code, you can categorize it in both of these ways. So it's possible to categorize any piece of code artifact and put them in one of these 4 quadrants. Now it's relative. It's not like there's a gradient as well. Like if you can think of this as a plane where you plot points as well, if you want it to be more detailed about, like it could be here versus here versus here, etc. So, but roughly speaking, we can place code in one of these 4 quadrants. So then, like, what does this mean? Like, what kind of code lives in this first quadrant? It's both dumb and ignorant.
Pure functions.
Huh?
Pure functions.
Pure functions.
Yeah.
Okay.
X equals X times 2.
Are you saying pure functions cannot be clever?
No.
No.
They
Some.
can, but
That's too generic.
I think that's too broad a statement. I would say is object in Lodash is array, although you haven't seen its code. So we'll dig up this piece of code. I've dug it up before. It's not that complicated. So this is a piece of code that is both, in my opinion, both very dumb and very ignorant. It's very ignorant because there's no business domain language in here. It's all code speak. It's all talking about objects and types and functions and values. Business people can't read this. They don't want to. So it's very ignorant. It's very dumb because the logic embedded here is very straightforward, and there's very little content in the first place. It's 2-line function. Can anyone else think of other examples, perhaps from our code base, that you would put in this first quadrant here?
get. Well,
Get, like Lodash get,
Yeah.
is actually somewhat clever.
Yeah.
It's a recursive function. I'll actually put it over here. Lodash get. Or Lodash fp get. Ooh. Oh. And set is even more clever. I love this function. Let's go to this quadrant then. So examples of code artifacts that are both clever and ignorant. I used 2 examples. What are some others? SQL. Yeah, a SQL database, SQL engine of some sort, or any kind of query language. equal. For those who don't know, equal is our in-house query language for querying data. But really, I would actually put most of Lodash in this category, except for probably these few that are like this in this quadrant here. There's a lot of Lodash that go in here. RxJS definitely belongs in here. If you are a framework, you probably should belong here. So I would put Angular in here. React.
If you write a function that uses set, Lodash set, that doesn't automatically make your function clever.
Oh, I'm not saying the code that uses this. I'm saying the code within.
Just the code within.
The code within set. If you crack open Lodash set and you looked at it,
Gotcha. So
it's actually very
So
intricate.
you're saying just your code itself isn't clever by the fact that it uses other clever code.
No, because you could have very savvy code that just happens to use the Lodash functions.
Right.
You could have a lot of business terms in that code. Store is something that we engineered here. It's a concept that we prototyped and we're using now in our apps. For those who don't know, and VMS is the view model store, which is sort of an extension of the store.
Well, that's more savvy.
So VMS, you're saying
It's not
should
a really
belong.
bad trajectory of going straight down into that quadrant.
Yeah. So store, to Rachel's point, I think store is actually lower on the cleverness scale compared to something like RxJS or React or Angular or Lodash, and that's actually why I like it so much. Even though it's clever, it's actually towards this way in the clever versus dumb scale.
Too. There's no business logic in the store. Now you tend to set properties with business logic, but those values don't matter.
Top is ignorant, so everything we've done so far is ignorant, except for the VMS, view model store. So what is something that goes into this bottom left quadrant? Some examples. A screen in our app that's very straightforward. Do we have any of those?
Would like the JSONs be like that?
The page config screens, like the JSON configuration, if we call that code. So the JSON
What
page
about it?
configs.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's dumb.
Some of it is clever.
The way that it works is
The JSON code, not the engine that makes the JSON code work.
so just the JSON.
Just the JSON code. That is an example of dumb and
But I
savvy.
would also say what's clever and savvy is the bad edge logic, because that's really hard to understand. And
Clever and
really
savvy.
can-
You keep jumping ahead on me.
Okay. Well, I'm saying as far as like JSON code, it's not all dumb and savvy. Like a lot.
From the perspective of the JSON programmer. Yeah, hopefully he doesn't have to do a lot of.
You know what it does, but you just don't know how it does it.
For people who
For the
don't
JSON.
know what this is, we built an in-house JSON-based language for coding pages and form-based pages and tables. So you can code an entire page using only JSON, and that's what we're talking about. And we built the engine that supports that JSON-based language for building pages. So I'm saying when you're coding up a page like that in just JSON, you're not having to do a lot of cleverness. It's mostly business verbiage that you're using in that JSON language, because you're talking about particular fields you have and the relationships between the fields, and those field names are
Yeah, I agree.
in business verbiage. Yeah. Any other example? Do we have any other like dumb screens, like code that's very savvy but very dumb? Like it's very straightforward to read. Widgets.
Like the financial module, like most of
Oh.
the screens in the financial module, It's
Okay.
like, you just code it. There's not generic logic and stuff.
Well,
That's what I do every day.
I think
That's
it's.
true.
I think the way it's currently written, though, is not straight. All the
Well,
time.
but it's tried. It's true.
In an ideal world. Okay, well that was hard. let's try this then.
The rest of the
Maybe
Be
generic
specific.
table.
Generic table.
Well, generic table is on the border, I think.
Okay, generic. We have a reusable component called generic table for rendering and rendering a table in the UI and also allowing editing of the data inside the table. But that's we really intend for it to be here, but at the moment it's sort of straddling the middle of
You
this editable grid or
Yeah,
work
right.
plan is probably in here. Form,
Churchill form.
the Churchill form, which is a generic component that has a lot of cleverness in it, but also has a lot of business logic in there, thus the savviness. And we have a work plan
Is there a lot of business logic?
component.
No.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
Okay, given this sort of like this world view that I'm overlaying on top of sort of code, that how we look at code, what's the insight I'm trying to give? I'm basically saying the code that's in this quadrant, the first quadrant, dumb and ignorant, that's a meh, as in it's probably not ideal, but it's also not hurting us. Like the presence of code in this quadrant probably signals that there's something about the underlying platform we're using that is lacking, and therefore we need to sort of fill in some gaps, like the platform being, say, JavaScript or Angular or
Like when we're
TypeScript.
escape-
There's no quick fix to that problem. We're just gonna live with it, and it's not hurting us too much.
So is the dumb and ignorant quadrant kind of like the
Yeah, a lot of the Lodash stuff that's not very clever. Like I just give 2 examples here. There might be more. That's just like sometimes I could have one-lined this, but I chose to use Lodash because it's more meaningful when it says is object than type of object or this and that and the other thing. So it's helping you, but not that much. The ROI is not quite as much as if it were to do something more than that. And then I'm saying code that's in the second quadrant here, clever and ignorant, that's good. We want that. And code that's in the third quadrant, dumb and savvy, that is also good. We want that. And I'll come back and explain why. But the code that's in the fourth quadrant, we should try to avoid this. So this is really my main point of drawing all these things out. I'm gonna try to perhaps rationalize why. You want to think about the sources of change in a software application. Where when change is happen, where is that coming from? Well, usually that's coming from the clients of the software. They require the software to have this feature and have that feature. Or the clients are driving the change. And because your clients are not software people, the verbiage they're gonna ask the change in is gonna be in business language. So they're gonna ask for things to change in terms of things that they understand, which is based on business language. So if all of your code that has business verbiage in it is in the third quadrant, that's gonna make our lives easier because all of that code, because code in this quadrant is easy to understand because it's dumb. You can read through the code and not be confused. So it's like, oh yeah, I know what that's doing. And then to satisfy my client's request, I just have to change this to be this, and I'm done. if you have code in the fourth quadrant that's affected, that's a problem because that's very clever. Thus, it requires a lot of mental power to sort out what's going on in the first place, to be the point of being able to modify it confidently and successfully to make it do the new thing that the client wants. However, if the clever stuff were ignorant, if they were in the second quadrant, then they're sort of insulated away from what the clients are directly asking for, in a sense, because it's so ignorant. Whatever they say, they are going to directly affect the savvy, the stuff in the bottom section, but not directly in the ignorant section. So there's a sort of insulation due to the ignorance of that code. But the fourth quadrant is the quadrant of pain because they ask for the things to change. You have to deliver it tomorrow, and you're struggling to understand the code that's there in the first place. So that's the rationalization of this. Yeah, any question and any comments from anyone at this point?
If your client is technical people and they want you to have your so
That's a good point. Your client might actually be technical people. They might want in on the design process, or I guess that's sort of like your client is like a developer actually, which does happen in real life. Like we might be a company that makes developer tools, for example, and then our client is actually developers. Their business domain is code. So they're talking about stuff like strings and arrays and models and stuff like that. That's an interesting scenario as well, but we don't necessarily have that. Well, we do have to work with some
Sometimes we're
people that is deep into the code as well. What are we really trying to do as a software team? If our goal is to make software that's more maintainable and also work better as a team in general, because your team is gonna screech to a halt if you don't have maintainable software. So basically you want to identify the code that's in here, and then you want to try to break it apart and move one chunk of it into here and another chunk of it into here.
Is there a hit list?
Yes, so whenever you're trying to work on improving the software that's already there, you might call that legacy code or technical debt, or however you want to frame that. If you want to improve the quality of the software, this is what you're trying to do. Come up with a clever way to break it up into two slices, and you move one of the slices to the second quadrant, move the other slice into the third quadrant. Okay,
Cool.
thank you.